أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So in the last session we had started off we recalled and re-summarized the idea of the four problems, and then we offered what the Shia response to those four problems was. And then we began to discuss what is the idea of justice when it comes to fiqh. And we talked about how for the Muslims of the past, this became important. For the Ahlul Hadith, they used this as another way of solidifying their previous positions, that they didn't want the aql, they didn't want the intellect involved in anything, and especially not in fiqh as well. But for the other group, the Ahlul Ra'i wal Qiyas, the people who wanted to use their intellect, the people who wanted to make their own opinions, make their own analogies through their methodology, the aql was, is a formative part of it, and they used the concept of justice to say that this is how we can reach ideas. If they couldn't find something in the Quran, they didn't trust the riwayat very much. They said, look, we're not going to follow most of these weak riwayat, we don't worry about chains, so we'll start to use our own opinions based on the idea of our aql, using a foundational idea of adala and justice. And the Shias, of course, said, look, you're on the right track, and some of the responses of the Ahlul Hadith to the Ahlul Ra'i and Qiyas we went through, but they say the Shia fiqhi methodology was a bit different. And we've talked about before, one of the main reasons why all of these issues would happen initially. For the majority of Muslims, remember, they have to figure things out as they go along. For them, the quote-unquote gates of wahi and revelation closed after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They don't have guidance anymore. The reason why Shias were in a much better position is because they had the Ahlul Bayt, right? Right after the fact, they were constantly being guided and given principles that the other Muslims, unfortunately, didn't have direct access to. So that's why there were huge differences, and we'll see this as we go along. So, okay. Now, what did the Shias, what was their sort of methodology? So that's the subsection that we're starting with today. So we mentioned something last time called al-qa'ida al-mulazima, right? This principle that said anything that the aql gives a ruling to, whatever the aql says, then the sharia will say the same thing. And then the other side of it too. If the sharia says something, the aql will agree to it as well. So we showed that there's a relationship between the two. The Ahlul Hadith said, we have nothing to do with this idea. We don't care about the aql, and the sharia is whatever Allah tells us. We find it in the Quran, in the riwayat. We don't care about any rational principles. But for the Ahlul Qiyas, Ahlul Ra'i, and the Mu'tazila, obviously, as a theological school, this was important. For the Shias as well, people asked, okay, do you Shias accept this idea? And we said, yes, we accept the idea. This relationship, to this day, our mujtahideen accept this principle, and it's used in fiqh, that there is a relationship. Now here's the difference. We say, yes, we believe in this principle of correspondence. The aql and sharia will always correspond. And we allow aql to be used in fiqh as well too. So basically we were, just like before, generally on the same side as the Mu'tazila when it came to theology, and the Ahlul Qiyas and Ra'i when it came to fiqh and jurisprudence. But as usual, although we agreed in principle, the way that we agreed was a lot different. So they said, look, we agree with the principle, we agree with aql and fiqh, but the issue is the way that you individuals, you Ahlul Qiyas and Ra'i, the way that you're utilizing it is not the way that we would apply in our fiqh. So if you remember, the Ahlul Hadith, they said their criticism, their objection to the Ahlul Qiyas was that what you guys are doing is using common sense. That's not the aql. What you're doing is just coming up with ideas as you feel like. That's not the same thing as using the aql, using rational, logical principles. So we rejected it as well, but we said a few different other things. So we'll list those out. Aql is allowed in fiqh. In fiqh we said that's fine. You can use it. But what you, Ahlul Qiyas and Ra'i, what you're doing is different. What you are doing is analogy. Right, what we said, Qiyas. In Qiyas we say no, that's not using the aql in the way that our Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salam have told us. We don't have this idea of using analogies in that. Why? We said because the aql is related to ilm, But qiyas is not related to ilm. Its correspondence is what we call dhann. Dhann is basically like an assumption, guesswork. Whereas ilm is obviously knowledge. So this is the difference. The aql gathers and utilizes knowledge and makes conclusions based on that, on certain knowledge, on actual knowledge. But dhann, that leads to qiyas. So we gave an example, and again, this is just a simple example, is let's say in someone's fiqh at that time, they said, we know that there is, for example, for them, they say music is haram. They say music is haram because it distracts people away from Allah. So that's the principles they're working with. Music is haram. Why is it haram? Because it distracts people from Allah. It brings their mind to something else. Said, okay, so therefore we can make an analogy. The Ahlul Qiyas would do this. If something now distracts you from Allah, that's a principle we're using. Since music is made haram for that reason, anything else that fits into that box, we're going to make that haram as well too. So what they would have, if they use that same principles, like many of their scholars would do something like this today. Well, watching movies, that also distracts you from Allah, so we're going to make that haram too. Playing video games, that distracts you from Allah, we're going to make that haram as well too. Anything like that will make haram. And they'll use the same idea, right? Okay, alcohol is haram because it is addictive. Fine. So therefore, anything addictive, we're going to make haram as well too. Say, okay, we're going to make chai haram now? Well, yeah, according to them, that they would have made something like that haram. God forbid, right? But that's the way that their analogy would start to, and again, these are just random examples, and it might sound ridiculous, but if you look in their books of fiqh and how they're deducing law, that's the kind of analogies and arguments they would come up with. So look, that idea of the reason why alcohol, or the reason why music, or the reason why anything is haram, where did you get that idea from? Who told you that? Is that in the Quran that this is the only reason why X, Y, Z is haram? No, you got it from dhann. You were just making it up. It's guesswork and it's an assumption. And we have the same principle that applies today as well too, right? And we'll get into that in a minute. So, the difference over here is the aql, as many of you know, the aql is an actual faculty, it's a power that Allah has given us. And the ulama of akhlaq talk about it as one of the four powers. So the aql is supposed to be utilized by us. But khiyal is another type of ability that Allah has given us, the idea of imagination. Not intellection, imagination. Imagination also has its role in Islam, but not when it comes to fiqh and jurisprudence. We can't just imagine the rules and imagine laws, and that's what people were doing. So this was the basic and main reason. They said, if you could have ever gained certain knowledge from this process of qiyas, then we would have allowed it, but you can't. Because you'll never ever be certain that that's the reason why something was made haram. And we have many riwayat, and if you notice, the conversations that the middle imams, the 5th and especially the 6th imam, alayhi salam, what they were having with the ulama of that time, the ones who were utilizing qiyas, was about the same idea. So when they were speaking, and if you look in the riwayat, it talks about do this, don't do this, and a lot of don't do this. And it's about, this is the way that they were engaging in fiqh. So let me give some examples. So one person, he comes to, there's a gathering, a lot of these riwayat you'll see, it's attributed to Abu Hanifa, right, the famous Sunni scholar. They say that he had a lot of sessions with Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Now there's a difference of opinion whether it was the Abu Hanifa that we all kind of know amongst the Sunnis, was it somebody else? Was it just another Shia listening in and kind of using somebody else's name? We're not exactly sure, but the principles here still stand. So, in this gathering with Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says to Abu Hanifa, ittaqillah wa la taqis fi ad-din bi ra'yik. Have taqwa in Allah, mean being conscious and aware of Allah, and don't do qiyas, don't make analogies in the deen and with using your own opinions, your own ra'i. فَإِنَّ أَوَّلَ مَنْ قَاسْ, because the first one who ever used qiyas and analogy was who? Iblis. La'natullah alayh. The first one to ever make an analogy, if we're talking about, the Quran, when we talk about the stories of the Quran, we think about it in terms of, let's say, time. Which stories come first? You can start with, okay, Nabi Adam alayhi salam, right? That's the first prophetic story. But the story of Iblis is actually the first story. The story is before Nabi Adam. So the first thing that Allah is trying to get us to understand in the Quran is the mistake, the grave mistake that Iblis had made. So what did he say? He said, I'm comparing what? Iblis is comparing his own physical creation of nar, of fire, to the physical creation of Nabi Adam alayhi salam, which was clay or dirt or mud. Right? And then he says, Wayhak, Imam Sadiq says, Ayyuhuma a'adamu qatlu nafs aw zina. He tries to solidify the point that you can't use analogy. So he asks Abu Hanifa, which of these two is worse? Is killing an innocent person worse, or zina, adultery? Which of these is worse? Abu Hanifa responds, qatlul nafs. Obviously murdering an innocent person is much worse than that. He says, okay. Imam Sadiq replies, why is it then فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ عَزَّ وَجَلْ قَدْ قَبَلَ فِي قَتْلِ النَّفْسِ شَاهِدَيْنِ. In murder, Allah will accept 2 witnesses. But when it comes to zina, فَلَمْ يَقْبَلْ فِي الزِّنَا إِلَّا أَرْبَعَ. But for zina, 4 witnesses are required. If this is so much worse, why would it take, less witnesses there? So he says, your analogy now is broken because of this idea. And this actually same one, there's a few different examples. I'll give one other that the Imam gives. ثُمَّ أَيُّهُمَا أَعْظَمُ. Which of these is better, as-salat or Sawm? Which of these is greater? And we might answer the same way Abu Hanifa answers, Salah is obviously greater than Sawm. Praying is better than fasting. He says, okay, fine. That's what Abu Hanifa says. فَمَا بَالُ الْحَائِضِ تَقْضِي صِيَامْ وَلَا تَقْضِي صَلَاةً. Why is it then that a female in the state of hayd, she does not have to make up her salah, but she has to make up her Sawm, if this is the better action? فَكَيْفَ يَقُومُ لَكَ الْقِيَاسِ فَاتَّقِ اللَّهَ وَلَا تَقِسْ. How can you do qiyas if you can't even get these 2 things right? These 2 simple issues in Islam you can't get correct, then don't do qiyas in anything else. So in the certain things in Islam that have riwayat and ayat, which were mentioned, people like Abu Hanifa and the rest, they couldn't figure out what was better, what was worse, the reasoning. He said, if you can't do it in the simple things, the obvious ones, then definitely you can't do it in these new unknown issues, right? So qiyas, the idea is, for them, they thought that it would lead to these Islamic principles. But as Imam Sadiq had mentioned to them, and as we recognize too, that it's a deficient and an insufficient way of understanding Allah's deen. It doesn't get you all the way. Now, it might help to think about something. Maybe this is an analogy, but it can't be used in fiqh. So Shaykh Mutahari mentions over here that there's 2 possibilities of what could happen or why somebody would actually end up using qiyas. One of them is out of dhulm and oppression, meaning they are actually trying to do harm to the religion, so they're entering in random ideas. And the other is they're actually a jahil. They just don't even know any better, and that's why they're utilizing these ideas. So the idea, what is the job of a faqih, a job of a mujtahid? What are they supposed to do then, according to the school of Ahlul Bayt? They do something called tafri', which we I think explained last time. So tafri' is where we have all of these general, let's say, usul, and principles that the Quran, the Sunnah of Rasulullah, of the Ahlul Bayt, these are the principles that they give us. And then throughout our lives, we have all these different questions and issues, right, that each require its own ruling. So the idea is we now need to, a mujtahid, a faqih is supposed to take this, whatever principles exist, and say which one applies over here, which one won't apply, which one can apply to both situations. This is what's called tafri', applying a general, known, certain principle to the actual instances that are on the ground. That's what a mujtahid is supposed to do. That's the difficulty of usul al-fiqh. Is you take these things which are known and certain that the Ahlul Bayt have given us. Give you some examples. We have, one example that the كل شيء طاهر حتى أن تعلموا أنه نجس. Every single thing, this is a principle that has been left by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Every single thing you come across is by default tahir until you get yaqeen and certainty that it's najis. So that principle leads us to something called asalatul tahara, the principle of tahara. Everything by default, unless you have some other information, everything is considered to be tahir and clean. Now this is a lot different than maybe some of our own practices as well too. Now I'll give you an extreme example, just to drive home the point. You walk into the bathroom. You see a pool of liquid on the floor, and you have young kids maybe being potty trained in the house. The assumption in our mind is that this is probably najis, right? Somebody maybe came in and had an accident. According to this principle, do we consider that najis or not? Now I know every fiber in our being is like, well, I want to think that it's najis, right? I'm not saying you jump into it and move your hands around in it. Yes, clean it up, sure, but let's say by accident you step into it, you don't have to wash your feet, because unless you have certain knowledge that that's actual, right, urine, you can consider it tahir. And again, this goes for many other things as well too. And yes, even if that liquid happens to be yellow as well too, right? Forgive me for saying it like that, but even if you're like, I really do think that this is something najis, well, is it possible that maybe your kid came in and spilled some juice or lemonade there? It's possible, okay. So you don't have yaqeen and certainty that that's actually najis. So this one principle, and there's many, right? We have the same thing for issues in food, and then in Sharia in general, our Maraji have a principle that again comes from the Ahlul Bayt, that everything is actually allowable and halal in Islam until we come across a ruling that makes it haram too. So we gave an example last time. Well, what if time travel is invented? Well, there's no ayah in the Quran about time travel. We have no riwayat. And let's say we can't find anything in usul al-fiqh that would apply to time travel. Then by default, because we can't find a reason to make it haram, it becomes halal. So there's multiple principles like this that the Ahlul Bayt taught to their companions, that the ulama now have inherited, that our maraji use, and that's how they come to these different rulings, right? And that's just a quick overview. And they're getting this because they say everything has been addressed by these usul, these principles in Islam. The problem with the other schools of thought is they think that there are things that have been left out of Islam. So their Islam becomes deficient. For us, we have riwayat, for example, this is in Usul al-Kafi, the book of al-Kulayni, rahmatullah alayh, in volume 1, chapter 20. The whole section of that chapter is called the section or the chapter of referring back to the Kitab and Sunnah, the book and the Sunnah, meaning the Quran and Sunnah, and that there is nothing from the halal and the haram and the entirety of what people would need except that the Kitab, the Quran and the Sunnah has addressed it and come with it. So we have 5 or 6 riwayat from the various ma'asumeen which talk about that same idea, that yes, everything has been addressed in some way or form. Either it's been directly mentioned as halal or haram or mustahab or makruh or whatever, or there's a principle that's been mentioned and a mujtahid, a faqih, a marja needs to figure out how does it apply. That's our methodology. Okay, so for us then, which was different to the previous schools of thought, now we come with 4 sources of law. Our sources of law are, of course, first and foremost the Quran. We have the Sunnah, and again, that Sunnah is primarily referred back to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, but his Sunnah for us continues with the rest of the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, right? We can get that information from them. So we don't just stop at the Prophet, we continue with that. Then we also have this thing called ijma'. Our ijma' is a bit different. We mentioned the Sunni version last time. The Shia version is a bit different. We have, this is not a fiqh class, so I'll skip that. But basically we refer to these scholars, the ulama that were closest and right around the time of the later imams, especially the 12th imam. And we see that, okay, we don't have something in the Quran, we don't have a hadith, but we see that all these ulama around the time of the 11th or 12th imam, they were giving the same rulings, right? They were saying X thing is halal or X thing is haram. So that is giving us maybe a clue that there might have been a hadith that we don't have anymore that they were basing their fatwa off of. So ijma has something to do with that. It acts as a pointer back to, usually to the sunnah, right? That's how that works. And the last, which the other ones don't have, is we actually say, no, you can use the aql. Sorry. But the aql that we're talking about is when it's certain and it's based on ilm and not based on assumptions. Now, again, this class is not meant to discuss how the aql is used in fiqh, but the way that you and I would conceive of it, let's just say it's not that. If you haven't taken a class in logic, like in mantiq, then we wouldn't know what it actually means to sit there and go through like logical premises and make sure a conclusion is actually certain. The way that you and I normally think that something is logical or reasonable is when we use qiyas, we use dhann, we use assumptions. That's what we're usually doing. It's not based on certain knowledge. Because whenever we think, if you have that question, we asked, we gave the example last time of moon sighting, right? Of one unified Eid prayer that everybody talks about. We said, okay, are you absolutely certain that that's exactly what Allah wants? That 100%, no doubt that Allah wants unity over everything else. And some people may think that they have certainty, but they don't. And especially because we have riwayat that even during the time of the Imams, there were multiple Eid prayers, right? So that one historical point would kind of throw that idea under the bus. So you have individuals who feel like they have certainty. They think they're really sure, and when you ask them and you push them, Have you really looked at all the ayat that are related to this issue? Have you looked at all the riwayat related to this? Have you studied the previous opinions of mujtahideen from the beginning, at the time of the imams, up until now? Do you know what their research is, their evidence is? And for most people, it's not, because that's obviously very time consuming. It's usually people who are just, I've thought about it myself for 5-10 seconds. I heard one random majlis and now I'm going to come to my own conclusion. Okay, enjoy your own fatwa, but that's not how ijtihad actually works. It's a lot more detailed than that. Okay. So this is wrapping up this subsection of the Shia fiqh method. Now there's one final subsection here, which is the last one for the introduction. The final subsection he titles The Real Origin. Meaning, and what he doesn't say over here, the real origin of justice, right? And not justice of where does justice come from, but his question, Shaykh Mutahhiri's question is, why are Muslims back then, even now, why are we so obsessed with the concept of justice? Why is it at the forefront of everything? Why do we constantly think about this idea? Regardless of somebody's level of practice in Islam, regardless of whether they were born into it, whether they came to Islam later, whether they're a lay person, whether they're a scholar, why is Islam, and therefore Muslims, so obsessed with this idea of justice? And he goes back to the basic idea. It's simple, it's the Quran, that's why. The beginning, as the revelation's taking place, all throughout the Quran, this concept of adl is coming there. So if Allah is trying to instruct people of how to frame their lives, how to think about every single aspect of their life, and He's using the word adl and justice, or in other ayat qist, which means equality or fairness, then that obviously is going to prime the way that we think about things. So he gives some examples of the various dimensions that this is addressed. So I think in this section he breaks down, I think maybe 4 or 5, yeah, maybe 4 different dimensions of that. And they kind of go from one to the other. So the first dimension of justice is called ontological, which is a fancy word talking about like wujudi. Wujudi meaning having to do with the idea of being and creation. So the idea of the world, the cosmos, everything being created, that's being addressed in the Quran with this idea of adl and justice. So we'll just give the examples, the ayat that he uses. So he uses Surah Ali Imran, Surah 3, Ayah 18, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Shahidallahu annahu la ilaha illahu wal malaika wa ulul ilm qa'iman bil qist. La ilaha illallah, la ilaha illa huwa al-azizul hakim. So Allah Himself bear witnesses that there is no deity except for Him, as well as the angels and those with knowledge. They also bear witness that what Allah is maintaining, He's qa'iman bil qist. He's maintaining the sense of justice and equality and fairness. So this is one, it's not talking about any specific issue. It's just saying Allah is in constant, in terms of all of existence, maintaining the sense of justice, fairness, and equality. Another example is in Surah Rahman, Surah 55, Ayah 7, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ. So the heaven or the higher dimension, Allah raised it and imposed upon it al-mizan, the balance. Right? So that there's that same idea of justice there too. And there's a riwayah that Rasulullah does a tafsir and explains this, بِالْعَدْلِ قَامَةَ السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضِ. That the higher dimensions of reality and the lower dimensions of reality, right, there's 7 total, all of these stand firm with the idea of adl and justice, right? This is his tafsir of this specific part of Surah Ar-Rahman. So that's one part of it. The second has to do with a sort of fiqhi, or legislative, legal. So there's a legal idea of justice in the Quran as well too. And it's based on the idea of kind of social order. Allah throughout the Quran wants us to have a society where everybody gets along. Right? Everybody maintain a good, just society. Okay, well how is that going to happen? a just society can only happen when there's just laws. You have unjust laws, you're not going to have it. You're going to have a society filled with oppression, obviously, right? So some examples of that is Surah Al-Hadid, Surah 57, Ayah 25. And I'll skip towards the end where it's related. لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ, that without a doubt we sent our rusul, our messengers, with bayyanat, with clear explanations and proofs. وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعْهُمْ, and we sent along with them Al-Kitab wal-Mizan, and we sent them the book and the Mizan. So book, whatever book that specific messenger had, and Mizan, that same scale that they were supposed to use to establish justice. And Allah mentions why. لِيَقُومَ النَّاسِ بِالْقِسْطِ, so that way people could maintain and stand up for justice and fairness as well too. In Surah A'raf, Surah 7, Ayah 29, Rasulullah is ordered, قُلْ أَمَرَ رَبِّي بِالْقِسْطِ, that say, Ya Muhammad, that my Rabb has ordered justice upon me as well. In Surah Baqarah, Surah 2, Ayah 282, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا تَدَايَنْتُمْ بِدَيْنٍ إِلَى أَجْلٍ مُسَمَّى فَاكْتُبُوهُ وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ. So all those of you who are mu'mineen and have iman, whenever you establish a debt, you contract a debt, meaning you engage in a loan with somebody for a specific yeah, okay. So, subhanAllah. So when you contract a debt for a specific time, write it down and let a scribe, let somebody write down these terms of the contract between you, bil adl, in justice. Right? We're recommended, it's highly recommended that whenever you engage in any sort of legal contract, especially a financial contract, write the terms down. Even between friends, even between family members, you engage in a contract, write things down. Right? Things get lost in people's minds, people forget things. It's not good to just say, well, it's okay, we don't need to write things down. No, Allah's saying, write it down. Trust me, it's better for all parties involved. And then later on, it's a long ayah. At the end, Allah mentions, أَقْسِطْ عِنْدَ ذَلِكُمْ أَقْسَطُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. This thing has more equality and fairness in the sight of Allah. Right? Because what could happen eventually, let's say the two people disagree, the person who, the loaner and the loanee. Okay, I'm paying you back, here's your $500. What are you talking about? You loaned, I loaned you $1,000. No, it was 500, no, it was 1,000. I've got WhatsApp messages, I don't have those same messages, what are you gonna use as proof? If you had it written down, then you just bring that to a court and you'd be okay, or a qadi, a judge, right? Or even the person would say, okay, you're right, sorry, I was wrong, you're right, I did see the message. But if it's just up in the air based on our broken imagination and dhann, then there's a good chance that shaitan will jump in there and start to make people conveniently forget things. So you have to be very, very careful of that. So this is in terms of the legal aspect that Allah has mentioned throughout the Quran of maintaining justice. The third aspect and the third dimension is the sort of political dimension. Particularly when it comes to the idea of leadership. When we say leadership, we're also talking about divine leadership, although it's any sort of leadership that happens. So of course, when we recall the famous ayah, Surah Baqarah, ayah 124, Allah saying, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, قَالَ إِنِّي جَعَلُكَ لِلنَّاسِ إِمَامًا, that I am making you for people an imam, a leader, right? And then what does Nabi Musa alayhi salam, or Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam, what does he say? وَمَنْ ذُرِّيَّتِي, okay, what about my descendants? Like, are they going to be imams as well? What about them? What does Allah say? قَالَ لَا يَنَالُ عَهْدِي الظَّالِمِينَ. My promise, this covenant, doesn't include zalimin. It doesn't include oppressors, meaning no one that has this form of divine leadership is ever going to be a zalim, will ever be engaged in injustice. Right, so this is the third dimension. And the final one is the individual type, we just call that moral. Right, individual or moral justice. So that's, of course, many places in the Quran where, I'll skip these so that we can move on to the next part. But we know that in the Quran, for whenever an issue comes up in court, whether it's talaq, it's divorce, or again, in a court case, Allah says, in order for something to be adjudicated, bring forward two, not just any witnesses, they have to be adil. So this is now a new legal system that was brought, right, amongst the Arabs of that time. So if they're hearing in the Quran that, okay, we have to live, in order for us to be a witness, a proper witness in court, I have to be adil, I have to have the sense of justice. Okay, so what does that actually mean then? Right, so that would be a question that would be in their mind. Right, and I'm skipping, there's other ayat, but you can go through the rest. So, what is justice now doing when we look at how it's pertaining to all these different dimensions? Justice, when it comes to the idea of tawheed and ma'ad, of Allah's justice, of the afterlife, this is talking about the sort of ontological idea that Allah is creating everything with a specific idea in mind. And when that happens, that means we are supposed to think about the world in His eyes as well too. If Allah's creating it in this specific manner, through justice or with justice, standing up upon pillars of justice, resting upon that, that means I have to see that in that same light. So if the world seems bleak and dark and oppressive right now, is that my eyes? Is that the media's, Western media's eyes? Is that a pessimist's eyes? Is that the way Allah wants me to see things? And the answer is no. Allah says no. Nur is always going to dominate dhulamat. Justice, righteousness, goodness will always be dominant over evil and injustice, even though others might try to make it seem the other way. When it comes to wahi, to nubuwah, to the sharia, to the legal aspect, Allah says, look, there's a standard and criteria. This is your fiqhi foundation. That this religion that's being given to you through the prophets that I've sent to you, they're not making up laws as they go along. This is not to their own benefit. This is based on the same ontological foundation that I've made for reality, but that comes down to your dunya as well too. So how you guys maintain a society, how we're creating a law, and how Sharia will act, even though it might seem it's different, it might seem discriminatory, it's not. It's based on these same justice principles of justice. And to ensure that, the political leadership that Islam demands is going to be one out of justice as well too. Where you see it failing is when other individuals, other Muslims, they don't have the same concept of justice. So for them, in their conceptualization of Islam, they could literally have a Yazid or a Muawiyah lead their governments. They can have a Saddam and they can't say anything about it because that's what Allah wanted. Even if in the extreme case, let's say Iblis, Shaitan, took physical form and wanted to go and become a political leader and was quote unquote voted into one of these Arab countries, they wouldn't say anything. They'd say, well, that's what Allah wants. If he got voted in, we can't do anything about it. This is how broken their system of leadership is. And you see, this is the difference between khilafah and imamah. Khilafah is any random person can go up and lead, even if they're a zalim, an oppressor, and a fasiq. But we have a system of divinely appointed leaders. And the last two parts, I already went through the other one, but the moral responsibility then, it tells us in order for me to establish a society that's just, I have my own individual responsibilities. If I see an injustice in the world, well, I have a duty to make sure that I stop that. If I work towards a political system and a society that's just, then that means that the legal system, that I have to interact with that same system as well too. The Sharia is going to be the best system that I can utilize for that. And all of this is so that I can see, as the Christians kind of say, God's will be done, right, on this earth. That's what we're trying to do. Whatever Allah wanted to establish on the earth, it doesn't matter where we are. Now, this is not us trying to say we're establishing Sharia law in the West, but if something is in the spirit of the Sharia, then that would obviously be something that we would want to go towards. So as an example, because people talk about this in a Western society, if, let's say, in Seminole County, right now, let's say in the next election, there was an option on the ballot box for our county becoming a dry county. A dry county meaning that there are no liquor stores allowed in this county. Now, people can consume, but they cannot purchase here. And there are counties that are like this throughout the US, where it's a dry county, there are no liquor stores, so people have to go somewhere else and purchase it and then kind of bring it back. So let's say something like that actually came on the ballot. You see, usually there's two kind of types of Muslims. The ones that have been inculcated and I would say brainwashed by a Western secular sort of liberal system are going to say what? Well, I can't impose my will on anybody else. Other people want to drink, I can't stop them. So either they'll vote for everybody's freedom, meaning the freedom to get behind the wheel and drink and drive, unfortunately, or just to drink and be involved in domestic violence, whatever it happens to be, or just destroy their aql at the very least. Where that framework is allowing people the freedom to harm themselves and society. And what that person's really saying is that, Allah, I know that you want a sense of justice in the world, in this reality. I know that this legal system that you've created is actually the best system too. And that, okay, fine, we don't have that political system here, but on an individual basis, I'm going to have to disagree with you and we're going to have to go in a different direction. This is literally what a secular society means, is that this doesn't exist, this won't exist, and then this won't exist either. If you want to be a moral person, go do it in your own house, but don't do it outside. Don't do it in the public sphere. Whereas God-fearing Christians, Jews, Muslims say, no, we are trying to get this done, we'll use whatever system's available. So you'll see that even when there was in the US, when they had this movement of prohibition, when they actually constitutionally banned alcohol, do you know who were the people who did that? It was Christians. They said this is from Satan, this is ungodly to do this. And still to this day, even the other organizations that are out there, MADD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, it's a largely Christian organization. So if something like that were to actually come on the ballot, if we're supposed to vote our values, where our values are divine values, that's what we're actually going after. So we would push towards that direction. That would be our moral responsibility, right? It's a human ideal, it's an aspiration. And no, we're not forcing anybody, right? We're not doing it like some governments and some countries do, right? Where they're dropping bombs on other people and forcing them to believe in what they want. No, we're saying that you have a system over here, democracy. We're using that system for what we think is the best thing possible. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, that's fine, right? Okay. Now, this whole conversation about, so this subsection was, why was justice important to Muslims? Because the Quran addressed it. Now, you might be thinking, that's so obvious. Like, we know that justice is important. We know that it's addressed in the Quran. Why would Shahid Mutahhari even bother with this conversation? And it's because of the last few points that he mentions. It's because, and it's related to the last point we mentioned, the response by many individuals in analyzing different things, even the concept of justice, is that, you know what, I'm not concerned with how Allah addresses things in the Quran. I have my own interpretation and I have my own analysis of how we're supposed to view society, how we're supposed to view the problems of society. There's one lens of saying that Allah wants us to think about the problem in this way and think about the solution in this way. But there are many, sometimes we do this, unfortunately, where we take this Quran, we take this book, and we say, you know what, Allah, I know you have your own ideas, but I have some of my own opinions on this too, and I'm going to force feed it into your book. So he goes through some examples. Now, the reason why it mattered for Shahid Mutahhari in that society, anybody have an idea of why he was very forceful about this idea at that time? Around the revolution, before it, after it, during it? Any idea what was happening there that would cause him to want to address people who are force-feeding certain types of ideologies and philosophies into the Quran and Islam in general? Do you know what ideologies were being force-fed into people there? Sorry? Marxism, right? Is that what he said? Yeah. Yes, Marxism and communism. Remember, at that point, many of the Muslims had been studying in Europe, right? Even people who, even to this day, you have many of the ulama, they'll go and they'll study in a different country and they'll come back, and some of them come back with Western ideas, and then that reshapes their understanding of the Quran and Islam. It happens. Sometimes it's for better, a lot of times it's for worse. So we had many famous individuals that went overseas, they went to Europe, they were infatuated with Marxism and communism, and it made sense because it offered them one solution on how to solve the inequalities of the society, the financial inequalities. And that's what Iran, under the Shah, that's what they were facing. And some of them didn't know that there was an Islamic solution to this. So when they came back, everything was being explained through the even the way that they analyze religious texts, they actually use these same communist principles. So for an example, the story of Habil and Qabil, Abel and Cain, Cain and Abel. What was their fight about? Again, we can look in the tafsir to see why they argued. The very simple answer in the Quran or in riwayat is that Qabil was jealous of Habil. It's hasad, it's jealousy, right? So we would say it's an akhlaqi issue, short. So communist writers, and according to some, Karl Marx himself commented on this. He said, no, the issue, anybody know what he actually broke this down and why he said, he actually thought that Cain was in the right and Abel was in the wrong. So what was the sacrifice of Habil? What did he sacrifice? An animal, right? Cow, an animal. And what did Qabil sacrifice? The corn, right? So according to Karl Marx, he said, this represents the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. He said, Habil had access to the means of production. He was the owner of the farm, so he could have access to the higher means, which is the cattle, the cow, the calf, whatever. Qabil was this poor individual who didn't have it. He was just a simple worker. So all he had was the scraps, which was the corn. So he's making some case that Qabil, in a sense, was this poor, broken down, right, individual of a lower class. And again, that's how Karl Marx or communism tries to explain everything. It's about economics. It's about who has control of the means of production and who doesn't, and there's a constant struggle between those. That's the idea. So that's how he explained it. And this stuff started to seep in the minds of the Muslims, especially in Iran back then. And it started to affect their way that they thought. Even some Muslim sociologists and philosophers, and even some ulama of that time, that communism and Marxism started to seep into their Islamic idea. They started to look at ayat of the Quran and say, yeah, this is the interpretation of this, but they didn't realize it's based on communism or Marxism. And the same thing happens between us as well too. If you ask people, why is it that Maraji have differences of opinion? Why can't they agree? It's one Quran. They have the same riwayat. Why can't they agree on things? One, lucky uncle or auntie or youth comes along and says, you know what? What are they fighting over? They're fighting over power. And that power of controlling individuals, and they want all the taqleed to come to them. So they're going to give a certain fatwa so they get more people attracted to them. They're making them sound like an influencer basically, right? Or another famous answer that people give is, it's all about the khums. That's why they're fighting and arguing. This marja will give this because if he gives it like this and he gives this opinion, he'll have more of a following, then he gets more khums and he gets to have more power and money and control. I was like, have you ever seen like the actual property, the houses, the homes like that these individuals drive, and you're going to accuse them of being corrupt and greedy individuals? But again, this is what happens when people just force feed their own ideas, because they've been raised in a society like this one, where are these individuals who are arguing and fighting? What are they arguing about and fighting about? Money and power. So their assumption is, if this is the way to explain issues over here, then I'm going to apply it to everything else. I'll look back at Quranic stories, prophetic stories, stories during the Imam's time, and even now. Right now, given geopolitical events, why is US and Israel, why are they doing this in Iran? It's all about the petrodollar. It's all about China and Russia. It's about BRIC. That's how they describe it. Now, are these to some level correct? Yeah. Does this have to do with the petrodollar? To some degree. Does it have to do with trade? Yes. Does it have to do with currency and gold? Yeah, it has to do with that. But is that the main fundamental defining thing? No. That's not the defining thing. The Quran has its own system of how we're supposed to analyze these sorts of ideas. Other ideas, when people, and I still meet individuals like this too, where when they try to explain why Muslims are not so practicing, or why we have issues in our communities, whatever it is, they say, well, I read this article by this neuroscientist, and he says this is how humans function. That's cool, but our spiritual deficiencies are not explained by neuroscience. Well, Jung and Freud explained, based on this, we are all going after XYZ, right? They use Western psychology. It's like, okay, look, that's interesting if they have that in Western psych, that's fine, but our system of psychology is not the Western system of psychology. It's completely different. And the way that we analyze people's diseases, their internal spiritual diseases, is not through the lens of Karl Marx or Jung or Freud or any of these economists or Professor Zhang or anybody else. The way that they analyze the world is based on whatever they understand. We have access to Quran, Ahlul Bayt, Sunnah, the teachings of our Maraji, which are being as a continuation of the Quran and Sunnah. They have a specific way of analyzing these problems. So the reason Shaykh Mutahhari is bringing all this down is to try to say we have to return back to a methodology which is Quran-centric, which is Islam-centric, which is going back to say, how do the Ahlul Bayt deal with these sort of issues, and use that as a framework then to go back to this. So he says justice is that sort of defining thing. You can explain things in terms of struggles of justice and injustice. The Quran uses this all the time, of zalim and fasiq and things like this. But to say it's all about economics and finances and control over land, no, that's not the case, right? There are deeper issues at play over here. So that was it, okay. So that was, now a quick final summary of what we've covered. This is the end of the introduction. So there is a few points, right? The first point was about doubt. Shaykh Mutahhari was trying to get us to understand doubt is good if it's followed by research and understanding, and then you get to yaqeen. If a person has a doubt but they don't follow up and they don't ask questions, then doubt can be detrimental. The second is, why is Islam unknown or deficient right now? He gave some reasons. Some of our ulama do not explain it properly. They don't use philosophical methodologies, they use weaker methodologies. And those explanations are given to Orientalists or Western academics, and they don't have anything deeper to work with. So this is one of the reasons why he wrote a book like this. So what is his method? Obviously, this book employs a method called philosophical theology. Obviously, he uses Quran. He's going to mention riwayat, but the main crux of it is going to be based on philosophy, meaning pure rationality and logic and reasoning. The 4 problems we went through, I'm not going to go through them again. We went through that last time. The 4 problems that basically Muslims were initially going through, the answers of the Ash'ari, the Mu'tazili, and then how the Shia responded to those same things, which was similar to the Mu'tazilis, but we had a different approach to it. Then we talked about how justice started to emerge in the science of fiqh. We talked about how the Shias had their own methodology of dealing with it, much what we did today. Why justice was something that Muslims were thinking about, how it developed their worldview. And then we ended with over here was that the idea was, Shaykh Mutahhari says, I want us to think about how to view every problem through the lens of justice, or any other problem through the lens of how Allah is addressing it in the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. And that the Quran is supposed to feed us. We're not supposed to force feed our own ideas into the Quran. Please recite a salawat. Okay. So this was the introduction, so we can move on to chapter 1 now. Any questions about the introduction up until now? Okay, so the question was, we're talking about Western psychology is different than Islam. And you're asking if there's any intersection between the two. So you could use the word intersection, and to be fair, there are certain ulama who say that there is no such thing as Islamic psychology. They don't believe in that. There are some. They say there's nothing in the Quran really, or in the riwayat, which talks about psychology. So what we would then do is, it's called the minimalist methodology, that Islam has a border of the Sharia, and we look at the scientific methodology, what Western psychology says. We see, does it go against anything in the Quran or anything in the riwayat? If it doesn't go against it, then fine, Islam is okay with it. So they don't really frame that as, some do call it Islamic psychology, which I don't think is a proper way to frame it, but they'll say, yeah, we use Islam to kind of just make sure everything's in line. There are others that say, no, you can develop and build an Islamic psychological framework. So for example, child psychology is fairly easier, right? Because we have this famous hadith that says that children are in 3 phases, 0 to 7, 7 to 14, and 14 to 21, right? Many riwayat say, look, that's giving us an idea of child developmental psychology. It's talking about parenting. So that's giving us a framework. Some might say, okay, you have a few things like that, but that's not enough to build a strong framework. So let's say, okay, so we take those, we'll take stuff from Western psychology, we'll see where they intersect, and we'll kind of play back and forth like that. And then the other methodology, which is usually utilized by philosophers and urafa, or Sufis as well, is they say, no, we have something called ilm al-nafs, or ilm al-ma'rifatun nafs, the science of the self, or the psychology of the self, whatever you want to call it, of the recognition of the self, that we have specific spiritual faculties and powers. And the way that insan works is that we don't start with the dunya and work up, we start with the highest, the metaphysical, and we work down. So there are specific principles, just like there's principles in fiqh and anything else, there are spiritual principles for the soul and how it functions. That then passes things down, and that might come out, and Western psychology might say the same thing, and it might not. But the only way somebody would know is if they study it at those higher sort of levels of ilm al-nafs, or ilm al-ma'rifatun nafs. And it's very rare that you'll find people who study these things. Very, very rare, right? The majority of the individuals that are out there are Muslim psychologists, which is different than being an Islamic psychologist or an Islamic therapist, right? There are those who try the combination methodology to some degree, but it's very rare that you'll find somebody that's actually trained in the methods of the Sufis, the Urafa, the philosophers, that understands the soul and its faculties and its abilities, and then says, okay, Western psychology, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this it happened to get right. So one example is, okay, generally speaking, finally, after so many, I don't know how many decades, child developmental psychology in the West has caught up to the idea that yes, actually there are phases to child's developments. 0 to 7, I mean, some of them say 0 to 7 or 0 to 8, etc., etc. So they break it down like that too. Observational, and then abstract, and then hands-on. You know, they have a similar breakdown to what Islam has already offered. The idea of now that many child developmental psychologists say that they're supposed to play in the beginning, right? They're supposed to be generally freer. Like, okay, guess what? That's what Islam said too. So if the whole idea is Islam's already mentioned these things, and it's not just in the Quran or riwayat, there's deeper principles. If you had gone with that, you wouldn't have had to turn to Freud or Jung or any of these other individuals. Now, it's okay, once in a while you can grab them and say, yeah, they say it as well too, but what would somebody do if they're not trained in the science of the nafs, science of the soul, and they see something in Western psychology that sounds nice, sorry, this is kind of a long tangent, but it's an important point, then how would they know whether this is part of Islam or not? I'll give you one example, because this has come up in, this, you know, something that I've tried to research a lot too, and this does come up in conversations. In Western psychology, generally speaking, in therapy and counseling, what they'll say is, if somebody is dealing with a traumatic event, an issue, you're not supposed to take that and talk about, you know what, it could be worse. It could have been like this, or think about some other event, or even say, you know, I had something else in my life that was much worse. In general counseling, Western therapy principles, you're not supposed to do things like that. You're not supposed to redirect it somewhere else. But for us, as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, whenever we deal with a difficulty, a bala, a trial or tribulation, what is almost every time the default that we deal with? Yeah, we redirect it to Karbala. We deal with something different. We lose somebody, and what do? We don't say, let's have a wake and honor them. We say, no, we're having a majlis for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So Western psychology says, no, that's a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. And I've sat in meetings with, you know, Muslim speakers, ulama, psychologists, etc., who give preference to the Western system. They say, no, we shouldn't be doing that anymore. I said, you know, if somebody has successfully redirected their grief and their suffering to something outside of them, that gives them a purpose for how they can review and reorient themselves, wouldn't that be something better? Why are we taking this Western system? Now again, everybody deals and processes grief differently, without a doubt, but to just toss away a system that has been working for us so long, I think it's a little, I don't know what word to use. I don't know whether to say naive, foolish, arrogant, I'm not sure. But this is the kind of issues that somebody would face, right? And again, this is based on principles that we have as well too, right? This is just one example of many examples that would come in there. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Let's double checking Adhan time. Adhan is 12 minutes. Okay. We hit a new timer then, 12 minutes. Okay. So now we are on to chapter 1. Oh, sorry. Yeah, chapter 1, but technically it's our second Roman numeral. So this is titled Conceptual Outline. If we're going to start talking about justice, we can't just jump into it, according to Shaykh Mutahhiri, and say, all right, let's figure out if God is just or not, and what justice means. So hold on. We need to slow down. And this is a principle that I guarantee if we apply this principle in every discussion, debate, or argument that we have, this will save us a lot of headache. The reason why most of us end up in arguments or debates or yelling matches, whatever it is because whenever we are faced with a specific concept, an idea, we argue about it without ever actually discussing whether we have the same definition or not. Every single time. Anytime I've sat in a discussion or debate, people are arguing about some concept, but they actually don't have an agreement on the definition. So in most proper debates amongst ulama, a munazira, that one of the first things they do, and sometimes this takes them 2-3 sessions where they talk about what should be the definition, a working definition that we can both agree upon before we start actually tackling the subject. So obviously we have to do this for the concept of justice. You ask everybody in this room, we're probably all going to give some vague understanding or some subjective idea of what justice happens to mean. Right? So eventually, we didn't want to figure out what is the quote-unquote Islamic definition of that. But he says, okay, even if we don't do that, the first thing we need to do is break it down into 2 different categories. So the first subtopic is human versus divine justice. And what's very interesting about Shaykh Mutahari, and you'll see this about a real alim and scholar like him. You know, some people will say, well, I don't like your definition, so I can't have an argument with you, I can't debate with you. I can't prove my point because you're the way that you're thinking about it, your sources, your arguments are different, your definition is different, so I can't engage with you. Ulama like Shaykh Mutahari, like Shaykh Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, like many others, rahmatullah alayhima, they say, look, we'll take your definition or another definition, and we can even establish our points using your definitions as well too. It's a very, very tough thing to do. You have to be very well versed in a subject to do something like that. But so we'll go through this. He says, okay, so let's talk about first this idea of a common human understanding of justice, the way that you and I would utilize it. And this is the English that's in the book over here. Justice is observing the rights of others, and injustice is the transgression of those rights. I mean, it sounds simple, right? Okay, that makes sense. So the central component then is the idea of huquq, or rights. I mean, that's what people talk about all the time. Bill of Rights, human rights, their rights are being infringed upon or transgressed. That's what people are talking about, right? The right to this, the right to bear arms, right to life, right to privacy. People frame justice and fairness in this all the time. That's what most humans will do, and especially in a Western society, right? Now, from there is a concept which is necessary to understand about priority and ownership. If we want to have a conversation about rights, then we have to talk about the idea of priority and ownership. Anybody have an idea what that could mean? Well, let's start with priority. What does priority mean when it comes to rights? Sorry? You say who or what? What? Okay. So there's the what question, but when we talk about for human beings, usually it's the who question. But yeah, the what would work as well. So, as an example, I mean, it actually has my name on it, but yeah, this is actually my mug, right? Or tumbler, I guess is the technical term, right? So this is my tumbler, right? And I'm seeing multiple, you guys have your own tumblers over there too. So everybody has their own tumblers or water bottles, whatever. Everybody understands here that I have a priority over this. I have right to ownership over this, just as all of you have right to ownership over your things. So justice for me is, yarhamukumullah, I get to do whatever I want with this, and you deal with your items as you see fit. Injustice or oppression would be if I take somebody else's bottle, and I even just take it, even if I touch it, technically that would be violating the right of you and that bottle. And same thing, if you came and even grabbed it and moved it, that would still be infringing upon my rights. I have priority and precedence over this. Right? Okay, so that's one example. Where you have two people who have items or control over something, everybody has priority over that. Are there any situations where one individual will take priority and precedence over someone else regarding the same exact item? Any situations you can think of? You have two individuals, one item, they both feel like they have control and right and ownership over it, but one of them actually has precedence over the other. Yeah, what do you think? We have what, sorry? You and your brother's Legos, is that what you said? Okay, so you both think that they're yours. So who do they actually belong to? You have to repeat it because I can't hear from here. They belong to your dad. Yes, that's the perfect example. So the example that Shaykh Mutahari gives himself is the same one. He gives the example of where there's a difference in priority is when it comes to parents and children. So these are your Legos, right? So basically what you're telling me is that you could be sitting there and designing something, making something beautiful, and your dad can come along, he can grab them, knock everything over, and just build whatever he wants or break it, and he's allowed to do that, right? Yeah, it stinks, but he's allowed to do that. Why? Because he has priority over it. In a work situation, when we work for a company or a business, we have, okay, this is a work laptop, for example. Usually we're given sometimes phones, access to an office or a table, stationery, printer, whatever. We feel like we have ownership over it, but anytime our manager or our boss or our supervisor wants, they can take any of those things away. Like, no, you don't have real ownership over it. We have priority and we have precedence. So you have borrowed or lent over ownership. Okay. So what he's trying to establish over here is that priority and ownership, the way that normally we end up thinking about it is on a horizontal plane, where you have two individuals who have, I have item A, I have item B, and they're on the same plane, and that's where the infringement of rights comes in. But he says, no, that's not always how it is. Sometimes you have this vertical system, where this person has a right over this child, over that same exact item, right? So the parent can come and do, in a sense, whatever they want, because they're the real owner of this. So he says this is the same thing. If we're using a human definition of justice, if we're using that definition, the question is, can we apply this human version of justice to Allah? Is that the definition we're going to work with? We can't use this because we're not on the same plane as Allah. So we have to use something like this then. Obviously Allah is the creator of all things. Whatever we think we have, it's because Allah has given us that authority. So if that happens, then what are we supposed to do? If Allah takes my things, He destroys my home, my car, He takes my life, is the word injustice even possible then? Has He infringed upon my rights? I have no rights. He said, look, your rights are on lease. This is a rented right for you. So if this is the definition you want to go with and it's all about rights, then fine, you can do that. But guess what? There's no discussion of justice then anymore. It never applies to Allah. Anything that Allah does, because it's all subsequent to His will, His control, it's all His creation, He can do whatever He wants. In the same way that this is, my tumbler, if I take it and I throw it across the room and break it, you might not like that, but too bad, it's mine. I can do whatever I want. If Allah decides to create a hurricane, if Allah decides to, allow for this type of suffering to exist in the Middle East right now, we can't say that Allah is being unjust and oppressive. Why? It's His stuff. He can do whatever He wants. He can smash the Legos if He feels like. It's His property. So if that's the definition we're going with, then that's the way that it would be framed. So right in the beginning, even though that's not the definition we're using, he said if you want to use the definition, fine, but then you can't call God unjust anymore. You can't say that He does any sort of injustice. So then the question then, of course, is what? Is there a higher concept? Because if this human one is not going to work, right? Because we can't just shut down the conversation, right? Allah's obviously addressing the concept. So now, what idea do we have to do? What is divine justice then? And then we'll start with that, inshallah, next session. We'll talk about how in the Quran, there are 4 types of ayat which address, and we went through some of them before, but he wants to give us, 4 different ways of looking at the ayat about justice to show that yes, there is a specifically divine idea of justice. Once we establish that idea, that we have to attribute something to Allah called justice, then okay, now we can say, how do we actually approach the issue then of divine justice? What did the different schools of thought did? The same way we talked about how they dealt with the 4 problems, the same way that we talked about how the Shias approached it as well too. Shaykh Mutahari will say these different methodologies are utilized. He doesn't just do Sunni and Shia. He says here are the different schools of thought and approach in theology, in philosophy, and this is how they address the divine justice question. So we'll go one by one, inshallah. Allah provides a tawfiq for the next session. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ahli baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.